Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy at the City University of New York at Garevers College. I am Professor Felix Obi, and it is now 6:06 p.m. Typically, we allow 5 minutes of grace, and that grace period has now elapsed, and we're going to jump right into today's lecture. And afterwards, as is the case, always the case, we will shut down the video and then go into Q&A, and office hours continues as necessary. So in today's lecture, we will discuss the role of multinational corporations, or MNCs, in international trade relations. Obviously, this topic is important, not the least because multinational corporations, as I said during our preamble, are responsible for a significant proportion of goods that are involved in world trade. In today's lecture, and indeed through your assessment for this week, we will discuss some of the pros and cons of multinational corporations. Criticism and praise of multinational corporations also will be discussed. In particular, we will discuss multinational corporations in the context of international political economy theories and perspectives. Of course, there are 3 learning objectives for this week, as you should know. And upon the conclusion of this module, you will be able to master them. And just in case, those learning objectives are as follows. The first, of course, is to identify multinational corporations, to which I would say that a multinational corporation is a company that has business operations in at least one country other than its home country. By some definitions, MNCs, or multinational corporations, also generate at least 25% of its revenue outside of its home country. Notably, some MNCs may have budgets that exceed those of small countries. And that is really, especially if you think about the Amazons, and you think about the Facebooks, and you think about the LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy of France, and you think of Alibaba, AliExpress of China, among others. So yes, notably, some MNCs have budgets that exceed those of small countries, and many MNCs. And just, of course, to recap, MNCs is short for multinational corporations. So many MNCs are based in developed nations, but they can have a positive economic effect on the countries in which they operate, especially as multinational corporations can make direct investments in foreign countries. Advocates say MNCs create high-paying jobs and technologically advanced goods in countries that otherwise will not have access to such opportunities. Again, we are going to interrogate and tease this out a little bit. The second, of course, learning objective for the week is explain why multinational corporations are criticized for playing deleterious roles in host countries. To which I will say that yes, however, critics of this enterprise believe that enterprises believe that multinational corporations exert undue political influence on governments, exploit developing nations, and create job losses in their home market. The history of MNCs is linked with the history of colonialism. Many of the first multinational companies were commissioned at the behest of European monarchs to conduct international expeditions. These earlier MNCs include, among others, the East Indian Company, established in 1600. The British multinational enterprise took part in international trade and exploration and operated trading posts in India, as an example. The Swedish African Company, founded in 1649, the Hudson Bay Company, founded in 1670, the Royal Niger Company, a mercantile company chartered by the British government in 1879 as the United African Company and renamed National African Company in 1881, and to Royal Niger Company in 1886. So these were tools of colonial powers to extend commerce and exploit the resources, some might say, of their colonies. And the third objective for the week is to discuss the role that multinational corporations play in the transfer of technology and trade in the world. So it is also true that multinational corporations play a crucial role in transfer of technology and trade in the world by producing the same quality of goods at lower cost. Multinational companies can reduce prices and increase the purchasing power of consumers worldwide. So again, this is possible because multinational corporations, as we now know, especially because of global supply chains and the efficiency of international trade logistics, companies are known to source materials at very cost competitive prices in the most cost competitive places. Obviously, this in the aggregate lowers the cost of goods and services. On the other hand, it should be said, and this is why we also mentioned as part of our key phrases in previous classes, dialectical thinking. We should also understand that these are not sterile actions when we say that multinational corporations locate goods and services at the most cost-efficient places quite often. This sometimes means the dislocation of jobs from even the multinational company's home country. So if you were to look at the fact that, that's just one example, those of us who are car nerds, or at least the car industry nerds, not so much car nerds, understand that many of the US car manufacturers, many of the smaller cars are not as profitable as the bigger trucks, which are the profit engines of US 3 major car manufacturers. So to increase the profitability, among other things, of these small cars, typically the US car manufacturers will locate the manufacturing of these small cars in Mexico. Again, this keeps the cost of production down and perhaps also increases the profit margin for the multinational corporation. Again, this is not a sterile business activity. To the extent that they move the production of these cars to Mexico, which is part of the US, Mexico, Canada trade area, USMCA, because the goods can move within North America, these 3 countries of North America duty-free. So there is no tariff in moving those cars. However, as those productions are moved to Mexico, it could impact jobs at US plants. At the very minimum, those will be workers that will not be hired in America, but would instead be hired in Mexico. And that is one way it can impact US workers. But on the other hand, for a US consumer who is looking to purchase a car, especially a smaller car that is made by any of the 3 big major US auto manufacturers, it could make those cars less expensive. And that means that the person's budget, the consumer's budget, can go a longer way. I say this to say that, we have to have a dialectical view of these issues to understand that on the one hand, these attempts to create efficiencies by multinationals could also cause and or create job dislocations in several areas. Of course, the other point also is that it sends high-skilled, relatively high-wage jobs to Mexico. So to developing countries, or at least in this case, in this example that I cited, Mexico. This is because although the average plant worker in Mexico may make less than their counterparts in Detroit, those plant workers are probably some of the highest paid blue-collar workers in the country of Mexico. So relative to the wage rate in Mexico, those will be high-paying jobs that multinationals are bringing to Mexico. More so, it is also high-skilled jobs because building a car, of course, required a certain level of skill. And that would be jobs that are now available to Mexicans that require a level of upskilling. And once you begin to have those skills in your population, among your citizens, other companies may want to take advantage of that skilled labor force. So that becomes a multiplier effect to that one investment by a multinational corporation. On the other hand, again, going back into dialectical thinking, because these multinationals bring jobs that are relatively very high paying for the developing country, they can exert or exercise a lot of political influence and economic influence in directing or constraining the decisions of the developing country. And on some level, or at least in the worst case scenarios, a bit of state capture. So, but again, this is just really so that we can think of the issues broadly rather than just taking a slapstick decision to say this is good or this is bad, but to say that there is a mix of advantages and disadvantages that come with. And the idea is for each government to try to find a balance, a healthy balance. That is really the challenge. So as such, on the other side of the ledger, there is a trade-off of globalization, as I just explained. At least I hope I did. The price of lower prices is that domestic jobs move overseas, as I just cited with the example of General Motors and Ford and Stellantis Chrysler, among others. This can increase unemployment in the home country of multinational corporations and make it difficult for long-term employees in outsourced industries to find new jobs. Because most times these plants are the biggest industries in the locations that they are in. We can take an example and look at the Rust Belt of the United States that stretches from Pennsylvania through Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania through Ohio and the rest, and into Indiana too, which used to be the steel belt of the United States. And those jobs have evaporated, leaving towns blighted, and no real strong economic base has been rearticulated since, although that continues to be the challenge of economic development professionals. So the learning outcomes for this week, obviously, is one, to differentiate between foreign direct investment, control, and portfolio investment, no control. So foreign direct investment control implies investment by foreign investors directly into the productive assets of another country, while portfolio investment means investing in financial assets such as stocks and bonds of entities located in another country. So again, foreign direct investment is that, again, GM, as an example, General Motors, goes to Mexico, again, as an example, and builds a plant. That is an investment. It's a foreign direct investment in Mexico. While portfolio investment means investing in financial assets such as stocks, bonds of entities located in another country. On the other hand, let's say that there is a company in Mexico, and again, I'm just sticking to, for purposes of simplicity, I am sticking with the Mexico analogy and not for any particular reason other than that. So let's say that there is a company in Mexico that makes very popular tequila that sells very well in the international markets. So either a portfolio investor or a rich investor or an aggregate of rich investors go into Mexico and purchase the stocks of that tequila company. That will constitute a portfolio investment. So in this case, investors are not investing in a plant. They are buying up shares in an investment or a corporation that already exists in a country. Or that they are buying up bonds, which is debt for the country, which is businesses located in the country, or maybe even sovereign debt. Sovereign debt means that is the debt of the government of that country, by the way. So note the major decisions that a multinational corporation should consider regarding how it selects and operates in a specific location. including, among others, opportunity for improved efficiencies. So it's important to understand the decision-making process for multinational corporations in their decisions regarding how they select where to invest and operate their business. So some of the factors that multinational corporations will be looking for is opportunities for improved efficiencies, lower production costs, and even larger market share. So another significant strategy for multinational corporations is transfer pricing. This is when corporate tax rates differ among countries. Multinational corporations have an incentive to set its transfer price in a way that reduces its tax burden by reporting higher profits in the country where corporate profits are taxed much lightly. So a big example of this is Ireland, the country of Ireland. Note that there is a difference between Northern Ireland, which is a part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and Northern Ireland. Then there is, and on the same island as Northern Ireland, is the independent country that is called the Republic of Ireland. It is often a very good example to understand the strategy that multinational engage in that is called transfer pricing. Many multinational corporations are headquartered in Ireland, but they don't necessarily produce anything in Ireland. But because Ireland has cheap, at least relatively lower corporate taxes relative to other EU countries and indeed many other advanced economies, most companies choose to locate in Ireland and therefore, to the extent possible, recognize their profits in Ireland. That way, they pay Ireland corporate taxes, which again, as I said, is relatively lower. This makes Ireland much more prosperous on paper than it is in reality. What I mean by that is that when these countries register these profits or earnings in Ireland, it is counted as part of the GDP, gross domestic product, or the total value of goods and services produced in Ireland over a given period of time. But the reality of it is that that profits that is recognized does not have a high multiplier effect in the economy of Ireland, because in the economy of the Republic of Ireland, because as soon as that profit is recognized in Ireland and the low corporate tax is paid, most of those funds are moved out of Ireland and then go into other places that is part of the country's multinational corporation strategic growth plan. Sometimes it is investing in plants, sometimes it's buying back its own stocks, and sometimes it's paying dividend. But many of this economic activity does not occur in Ireland. So the multiplier effect of this economic activity is not felt in the Irish economy to the extent that the GDP might suggest. Now, it's easy to say, well, then why would Ireland continue to engage in this practice? Although I'm sure they would prefer that they enjoy more beneficiation from this tax recognition of income or profits in Ireland. The truth is, if they didn't have the relatively lower taxes that they collect, is still a revenue stream for the government that they otherwise would never have enjoyed if they didn't have a competitive tax strategy for the country, which is why many in the G7, which is the group of seven is the 7 wealthiest industrialized but democratic countries. They used to be the G8 until Russia became significantly undemocratic, and then, of course, culminating in their invasion of Ukraine, and it went back down to G7. there is conversation in the G7 for a minimum international corporate tax. Because what you don't want to have also is a race to the bottom, where another country gets a bright idea that it's going to try to steal some of this strategy of recognizing multinational profits in Ireland, is going to try to steal some of those tax profits by setting their corporate tax rate even lower than Ireland. And then, of course, another country or maybe even Ireland will then go lower, and then it becomes a race to the bottom, where government, in an attempt to capture some of these shares in corporate profit taxes, will end up having minimally nothing to fund public services. So that is the risk and the fear and the concern, which is why, again, the G7 is now advancing the idea of a minimum global corporate tax rate. So the other outcome is to differentiate the perspectives of liberals, realists, and historical materialists about multinational corporations. And lastly, note the difference between horizontal and vertical integration. So horizontal integration is when businesses grow by acquiring a smaller company in their industry at the same point of the supply chain. Whereas vertical integration is when a business expands by acquiring another company that operates before or after them in the supply chain. And here is what that can quickly mean. So a vertical integration could be if CVS were to buy Walgreens, as an example. They are both storefronts, and they are both at the same level in the supply chain. They are the end user. They retail to the end user in the supply chain. So if a CVS were to buy a Walgreens, that would be a horizontal integration in the supply chain. Whereas if a drug manufacturer, let's say Pfizer, were to buy CVS or Walgreens or any front-facing pharmacy, it would be a vertical integration because it will expand the supply chain of the Pfizer, which is a drug manufacturer. So in this case, Pfizer will go from being a drug manufacturer to a drug retailer. This strategy is good because it could increase profits for Pfizer potentially. And what I mean by that is that typically Pfizer would have to sell Medicaid drugs to Walgreens at wholesale price. That way, Walgreens will then mark it up a little bit to sell at a retail price. Then the markup between the retail price and the wholesale price that Walgreens purchases from Pfizer will be their profit margin, all things being equal. But if Pfizer were to open its own storefront, then instead of selling its final product at a wholesale price, it could conceivably make even more money by selling it at a retail price, all things being equal. But this potentially could also create a problem for Pfizer. It creates complexity, which can take Pfizer's focus away from its core business, which is research, clinical testing, and translating chemical compounds into therapy. You can see how it might begin to lose focus, which is why sometimes when conglomerates become too diversified, they can begin to spin off parts of their corporation so they can focus on their core business. One typical example that is being discussed, and this is the round tripping of this business strategy. Boeing owned a subsidiary that makes and continues to make the shell of Boeing planes. And that subsidiary was eventually spun off from Boeing because Boeing wanted to concentrate on its core business of designing and manufacturing and selling aeroplanes. Not so much in the big construction, right, of input products of an aeroplane. So Boeing spun off this company that makes shells for its planes. Any one of us who's been listening to the news lately should also be aware that Boeing has suffered a number of mishaps, beginning with I think it was an Air Ethiopia plane that was going to Kenya, or an Air Kenya flight that was going to Ethiopia, one of the two, that crashed. From that to the more recent Alaska Air plane that had a door, I believe it was an Alaska airline plane that had its doors blown off. This is creating obviously challenges that is affecting the share price of Boeing and investor confidence and customer confidence, both at the retail level, as some people don't want to fly Boeing, and many airlines are hesitant, or at least giving a pause to buying Boeing planes. So now Boeing is rethinking its strategy once again. It is thinking that outsourcing this business, or at least spinning off this business that manufactures the shell of its planes, while it has allowed Boeing to concentrate on its core business, it has also meant that Boeing no longer has direct oversight on the quality of a major component of its planes. And this lack of oversight and no direct control over the culture of the company that makes these shells for their airplanes may be at the heart of poor quality control that is creating these mishaps, that is affecting confidence in Boeing. In fact, their CEO is going to retire as a result, in part because of these challenges. So Boeing is now thinking whether it is now considering repurchasing this business that is spun off years ago, because it now realizes that controlling quality control is perhaps more important, or at least just as critical as concentrating on its core business. So I say this to illustrate why multinational corporations can have a horizontal integration strategy or a vertical integration strategy, or even a turnaround in any of these strategies that it may previously have pursued. With respect to Boeing in this case, it is a turnaround. It will be interesting to see ultimately what strategy the new leadership at Boeing would pursue once they get a new CEO. So, in summary, I wish you a successful completion of week 11. We're at week 11, module 9, which is multinational corporations. For next week, our focus will be international economic development. And let me quickly add that these two topics are really at the core of why we have an international political economy, because the whole study and the whole practice and the whole discipline of international political economy is to arrive at a system that allows for the efficient transfer of goods and services. What we want to do is be able to move goods and services, be able to handle the tensions that come from trade that could often spill over into political dispute that unfortunately could also spill off into kinetic wars. So on the one hand is our multinational corporations. On the other hand is an economic development strategy or an economic development philosophy of countries. So there is a reason why it is now a feasible business plan, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, for US car manufacturers, as an example, to locate their manufacturing, some of their manufacturing footprint in Mexico. This is part of a broader international economic development strategy for North America that began by NAFTA, or North American Free Trade Agreement. Very quickly, part of the challenge with NAFTA was that Mexico was quickly becoming a narco state. And this created uncertainties in the Mexican economy. This created a lack of inflation, a lack of investments, and the Mexican economy will go through boom and bust. Obviously, the country also has, Mexico also is rich in hydrocarbons. So it would also go through boom and bust cycles with the fluctuations in the price of crude oil. And eventually, whenever it does go through that boom and bust cycle, the United States to a large extent, and Canada to a lesser extent, if only because our economy is significantly larger than Canada's, would go out and bail out Mexico. So I think this began under President Clinton, realized that there needs to be a longer-term strategy to integrate the economies of North American countries to fundamentally place the economic development prospects of Mexico on a stable and solid footing, and therefore also reduce the pressure of immigration from Mexico to the United States. And as many of you may notice, many of the immigrants that come through the southern border with Mexico are actually not Mexicans anymore, but Central Americans, and indeed other nationalities beyond South America, Central and South America. Part of this is because of, again, what we covered a couple of weeks ago, regional trade agreement. This regional trade agreement become an international economic development arrangement between Mexico, US, and Canada. And it has led to large swaths of investment in Mexico. What many of you may also not know is that until recently, China was the largest, United States' largest trading partner, but that has since changed to Mexico. Again, this is because of the relative cost advantage of Mexico relative to the cost structure of the United States and Canada, and yet free access to markets, or at least tariff-free access to US and Canadian markets from Mexico. And of course, infrastructure to move these goods and services, chiefly rail and roads. So you will find out that because of geopolitics and geoeconomic tension, many Chinese firms, as an example, are beginning to hedge against political tension and potential for sanctions against China by the United States by investing some of their production facilities in Mexico. So if the United States were to sanction China, it would not, all things being equal, it should not affect Chinese investments in Mexico. So those goods and services will continue to pour into the United States to the benefit of Mexican labor, perhaps to the disadvantage of the Chinese labor that would have otherwise produced those goods and services. But this is just to illustrate how integral international economic development is to spurring investments from multinational corporations, and which is why next week's lecture is going to be as important and as critical as this week's. So with that in mind, I am going to shut down today's lecture, and the recording of today's lecture, go into Q&A, and obviously look at your papers and all the other housekeeping stuff an office did. So thank you very much. I am now going to shut down the recording.